entertainment.
Hello and welcome to Good Harvest. This is part 1 of the background slider tutorial where we demonstrate how you can create a background slider with JavaScript. While we only use HTML and CSS to provide the slider's layout but not the design just yet. However, in part 2, we will demonstrate how you can create a simple and sleek slider design and display where we mainly focus on HTML and CSS, and this will be posted very soon. Subscribe to Good Harvest, and without further ado, let's get started. So now we're going to be working on our HTML file. So first things first, we're going to create a comment so that our HTML file can be organized and neat, and so that we can navigate through our HTML file easily. So we're going to create a comment called homepage main background slider. So now first things first, we're going to create a div, and we're going to assign this div to an ID, and we're just going to call it slides container. Now the slides container for now will be separated into 3 sections. The first section obviously is the previous button section. The next section will be the background slider itself, and the third section will be the next button section. So we're going to be creating an element, and we're just going to put a backward sign for now. We're going to create another div, and we're going to set this to an ID called slides wrapper. So this is where we'll be including all of our slides, and then the next, our last element is our next button. So now we want to create our slides. So we're going to be including 3 slides for this video. So we can create a div, and we're going to assign each div to a class since we're going to be using this class more than once. So we're going to create a class rather than an ID, and we're going to call this class slide. And then we're going to include a text just for now, and we'll just call it slide 1, and we'll do the same for the rest. Now later on, our slides will be really long. It will have a lot of elements, a lot of content, so we're going to be creating a comment that will be very useful later on, and we're going to be doing the same for the rest. We also want to be able to indicate when the end of this slide will be, so we're going to create a comment called end of slide, and we're going to be doing the same for the other slides. Alright, so now when we check our HTML page, we can see that all of our elements that we've just created are visible. So now we want to layer it properly, and we're going to layer it with CSS. So first of all, we're going to be creating a comment, and we're going to call this comment slides. So this is so that we can navigate through our CSS file much more easily. And now we're going to be selecting the first element that we created, which was the slides container. And because it is an ID, we're going to select it with a hashtag and the name of the ID, which is slides container. Now since this slide container holds 3 elements, the first button, the slides wrapper, and the next button as well, so we're going to be creating, and we want them to be in one row rather than in a column as it is right now. So we're going to be using this property called display flex, flex standing for flexible. So now our layout will be much more flexible, and we can move it around as we wish. So we want the direction of all of our elements, all of our child elements, to be in a row rather than in a column. So now you can see that the arrow is first at the left side of the slide wrapper, and the next button is at the right side of the slide wrapper. Now right now they're taking up a very small amount of space in the page, so we're going to be setting the width, and we're going to set the width to 100%, so it should take up the full width of the page. And then the height, we're going to set it to 650 pixels, which is about the full height of this web page. Alright, so now the next element that we're going to be working on is our slides wrapper. So the button we'll be working with later on, and we'll be including an SVG for this, but for now our main focus is to show you how the slider will work with JavaScript, and then we'll be doing all of the designing later on. So for now, let's include the slide wrapper, and let's set the basic properties of our slide wrapper. And once again, because it is an ID, we've selected it with a hashtag, symbol, or character, and we want the slider to take up the full width of the page, or basically the full width of the container, which takes up the full width of the page. And then we also want it to take the full height of the container, which is set at 60 pixels. So the wrapper and each slide should have a height of 650 pixels as well. Alright, so now we're going to be including a flexible layout. So we want all of our slides to be set in one row rather than in a column, so that when we transition from one slide to the next, it seems that the slides are transitioning or moving horizontally rather than vertically. And with that, we're going to ensure that the flex direction is in a row rather than in a column. And now the second last element that we're going to be, or the last element that we're going to be working on is our slide element. And because it is a class, this time we're selecting a class in our CSS file, so we're going to select this with a character and then include the name of that class, which is slide. And now we're going to be, with JavaScript, we're going to be basically creating the transition by adding and removing a class that we will be including later on called active. So first of all, we want our slide to be set to 0%. Also but then our height should be set to 100%, so the transition should only happen width-wise rather than height-wise. We also want any content that is in the slide to be hidden, so that when we move from one slide to the next, there's no text that's just hanging around from the other slide in the next slide that is being displayed. Another thing is we want our transition to be pretty smooth, so we're going to use transition property for this, and we're going to first specify which property should have this transition. So we're going to be typing in the property name, which is width, and then how long this transition should occur, or how long the width should change, because we're going to change the width from 0%, which basically will ensure that the content will not be visible, to 100% in the active class. So we want the transition from 0% to 100% to be within 1 second, and we want it in both ways, when the slide turns from 0 to 100% and 100% to 0. So we're going to be using ease in, which basically is width from 0 to 100% should take 1 second, but we also want it vice versa when the width changes from 100% to 0. Alright, so now we're going to be creating the active class, and we're going to be including multiple active class for different events. So this first event we're going to be including it is for the slide. So we're going to first call the slide, and we're basically going to add an active class to this slide later on with JavaScript. So when a slide has an active class added to it, we want the width to be set to 100%. And right now none of these slides are set to 100%, so we're going to include the active class in our HTML page for slide 1. So we can see that slide 1 has been set to 100%, and also let's include some temporary properties so that we can see our slide much more clearly. So we're going to create a comment so that we can remove all of the properties under this comment later on. So first of all, when we're designing our slide, when we're creating the proper design, so first of all, let's create a little border around our slide so that we can see how long or how wide and how long our slide is. Now we can see clearly that the slide's width is 100% from the page of the container and 100% in height. Another thing that we also want to do is increase the size of our slide text. So now our slide text should be a little more bigger than before. We also want the slide to be centered to the center of the element. So we're going to be including the flexible layout so that we can achieve this. And now we're going to be including another property called justified content, which will position this the text, the element that is inside the slide element, into the center, but only horizontally. So now you can see that the slide or the text is now centered horizontally, but we also want it to be centered vertically as well. So we're going to be using this property called place items, which will center the text vertically as well. So now it is properly to the center of the page, so we can see it more clearly. So we're going to be removing these properties later on, since we're going to be designing our slides with images and a different darker layer later on in the video. Alright, so now we're going to be heading over, before we work on our JavaScript code, we're first going to be including the classes and IDs for our buttons so that we can access them in our JavaScript code when they're being clicked on. So first of all, we're going to be including a class called slide button, and this class will just be used for designing, so we'll not be using it in our JavaScript file, but we'll also include the same class in our next button. However, we're going to be including different IDs, of course, since IDs should be unique. So the first button will be the previous button, so we'll just call it prev button, and then the next button will be the next, the next button will be the next button. So this ID will be called next button. Right, so now we're going to be including the SVG icons, since our IDs are, our arrows are not so visible at the moment. So we're going to be heading over to Bootstrap icons, which provide free SVG icons. So in our search bar, we'll just search for chevron, which provide the arrows that we want, not the arrows with an extra line in the center, but 2-line arrows basically. So we're going to be copying the HTML code, and for this one is previous, so we'll paste it here, and we'll also be changing the width and height so that it is much more visible and clear. And then we'll also include the one for next button, which will be the arrow towards the right side. So we'll paste that in the next, under the next button ID, and we'll change the width and height to 40 pixels. So now our arrows are much more clearly, so we can now move on to our JavaScript code. So now, in order to include a JavaScript code, we'll be including it in our HTML file and under the head tag. So right after our style sheet link, we'll be including a script tag or creating a script tag. Alright, so in our JavaScript code, we'll first select the document, and we want to add an event listener, as we want the document to listen for any for this specific event that we'll add inside these single quotes, which is for the DOM content to be loaded, or DOM standing for document object model. And we want, basically, DOM is, all of the elements that are included, the structure, the model of the document, how the document is laid out, and we want all of that to be loaded so that we can select the elements that we want successfully. And then once all of the elements have been loaded, the structure has been loaded, everything of the document has been loaded, then we can create an arrow function, and whatever we include inside this arrow function will occur and will be processed only and if the document has been loaded, because we cannot select any element if the document hasn't been loaded yet. So first of all, we're going to create a constant, and this constant will basically store all of the slides, so it will act as an array, and it will store all of the slides, all of the elements in the all of the slides in the document. And all slides have a class called slide. So we're going to once again call the document, and we want the document to look for all of the elements that have the active that has a class called slide. So in order to select more than one element, we're going to use query selector all. If it was just one element we were selecting, we'd use query selector. But because we want to search for all possible elements with the class slide, we're going to use query selector all. And then in order to select and identify this element, we're going to, since it is a class, we'll identify it just like in CSS with a dot, and then the name of the class, which is slide. So just like CSS. And now we'll be creating another constant, and this time we'll be selecting the previous button, so that we want to select this previous button so that we can add an event listener, listen for any clicks, and if the previous button is clicked, then a certain function should happen. And also we're storing this as a constant. We're storing these 3 slides, previous button and next button, as constants, since the values are not going to be changed at all. The only thing that we are doing is adding event listeners, so the value will not change. Now we want the document once again, since this time we're going to be selecting one item, which is the previous button, and if we scroll down, we know that this element is stored as an ID, and we can identify it by an ID, which we call pre-button. So once again, just like in CSS, because it is an ID, we'll select it with a hashtag and then the name of that ID, which is pre-button, and then the same thing goes for next button. We also stored it as an ID, and the name of this next button element, if we scroll down and we check, is called next button, and we just select it with a hashtag since it is an ID, and now we can move on. Alright, so now we're going to be creating 2 variables because these values are going to be changed. We're going to, the first one will be called pause. So pause standing for position, and we want to get the position of the slide that we're working with. So we're assigning this to 0 because positioning in coding always starts from 0. So the first element will be stored as position 0 rather than position 1. This is so that we can save space, or we don't waste any space. And the next variable that we're going to create is alt pause. So this will basically store the old position, or the position of the old slide. So for example, if a change occurs, if the previous button was clicked or the next button was clicked, we want to get the old slide or the current slide that was being displayed, so that we can remove the active class, since we're adding and removing active classes so that they can be displayed, and we don't want the old slide to be displayed anymore. So we want to remove the active class, so we're going to use alt position, alt pause in order to access that, and then we're going to use pause in order to we're going to be using this in order to update it. We're going to be updating it in our functions so that we can access this, element, and we can add an active class so that it can be displayed. Alright, so now we're going to be selecting the previous button constant. And first we're going to be working with the previous button. We're going to be adding an event listener. So now we're going to be adding an event listener to this previous button. And we want the event to be a click. So if the previous button is clicked, then we're going to be creating a function, an arrow function, and this function should be processed only and if the previous button has been clicked. Alright, so if the previous button is clicked, we first want to access the position of the slide that is currently being displayed so that we can remove the active class, so that we can remove it from display, and then we can display the new slide that should be displayed. So we're going to be calling the old position element, or variable, and we want this to be set, and we want the value to be set to the current position, to the current slide's position. And then the pause variable itself will be updated. So now for the previous button, we're going to create an if statement. So the reason why we can't just, we can't just decrement the value of the slide's position by 1, just like that. That's because if the slide is at 0, if the position is currently at 0 and there's no other element before that, we add the first element of the array and we want to go, and the previous button has been clicked, then obviously and there will be a problem if we're decrementing 0 by 1, so it will be -1. So now what we're going to do is when the slide is, when we're at the first slide, so position is at 0 and the previous button has been clicked, we want the current position, we want the slide to go from slide 1 in our case to slide 3, or the last element of the array. We want it to move from the first element of the array to the last element of the array. So that is why we're going to be creating an if statement to check what position it is in. So we want to know whether position is less than 1. It would be better than setting it than asking if position equals to 0. Because in our else statement we will include the decrementation of position. However, a bug can occur and perhaps position is decreased twice, so I feel like it is safer to check if position is less than 1 rather than if it's if it's equal to 0, or we could even do if it's less than or equal to 0. So then if this condition is true, then we want the current position to change from the first position of this array to the last position of this array. So we want to get the number of slides that there are. So in our case there are 3 slides, so we can access this by including a property called length to the slides constant. So this will return the number 3. But since positioning starts from 0 rather than 1, that means we'd have to subtract by 1. So this value will return the number 2 rather than the number 3, because there are 3 slides, 1, 2, 3, but positioning starts from 0, so it will be 0, 1, 2, which is why we subtracted by 1. And if position is not, if this is false and if position is greater than 0, then that means position can be decremented anyhow. So if, for example, if it's at position, if we're at the last element and we want to go back, so in our case, if it's at slide 3 and we want to go back, it will go back to slide 2. If it's at slide 2, it will go back to slide 1. But if it's at slide 1, then position should be assigned to the last position of the slide or of the constant array. So we can decrement this by 1 if position is greater than 1. If it's greater than 0. So we're going to do pause minus minus, which is basically the same, but a quicker way of doing pause equals to pause minus 1. Adding 2 minus signs is much more simpler, much more easier. Also, there's a more efficient way of assigning the position value, because we're just assigning the same value. We're just assigning the same variable, it's just being assigned to different values. So there's a much more efficient way of creating this if statement, but we'll talk about that later on. So now the next thing that we're going to be working on is the next button. So we're going to add an event listener, and once again we want to listen for any clicks, and if this next button has been clicked, then we want to get that value. We want to get the current slide's position. So that will be stored in old pause, and then we want to create an if statement. So this time we're creating an if statement because we can't just increment the value of position by 1 just like that, because if the current slide being displayed is slide 3 and it's the last element basically of the slideshow of the whole slide array, and we want to move and the next button has been clicked, that can't be incremented since that slide 3 is the last element and the next button has been clicked. Then we, instead of, if the value of position has been incremented, for example, in our case from position 2, which is slide 3, to position 3, when there is no element that is stored in position 3, then an error will occur. So we want basically if we're at the last element and the next one has been clicked, then we want it to go back to the first element of the array, of this constant, which is slide 1. So in our if statement, we're going to ask whether position is greater than the number of slides that there are minus 2, which will give the value 1. And we're subtracting this by 2 rather than just by 1, because for example, the last position in our case is position 2 because it's slide 3. So position 2 is our last element, is the last position possible. And this value here returns 3 minus 2, which is 1. And we want to know if position is greater than 1. So whether it's 2 or if it's more than 2, and 2 is the last position. So if it's 2 or greater, then something else should happen and position should be at the first element, which is 0. However, in order to make this a little less confusing, we'll just set it just like in our previous button. We want to check if position either it's greater than or if it's equal to 2. So if it's 2 or greater than, then something else should happen, because I also had a little confusing moment. So this condition makes more sense. Alright, so if this is true, then we want the position of the slide, the next slide to be shown basically to be the first element, which is 0. And if this is not true, if the current position is less than 2, then we want position to be incremented by 1. So for example, if it's at slide 1 and the next button is clicked, it should move from slide 1 to slide 2, from slide 2 to slide 3. But if it's slide 3, then position should be at then it should be slide 1 that should be next. So this can be incremented by 2 plus signs. Just like here, it was 2 minus signs to decrement by 1. And this, in order to increment just by 1, you need 2 plus signs. Alright, however, there is a much more simpler way in order to create these if statements, because we're only assigning the same variable, we're just assigning it to different values. So a much more efficient way to create this is to use an one line if statement called a ternary statement, and basically we're going to call the variable that in which the value is going to depend on the condition equals to. Then the first thing that we're going to include in this one line if statement is the condition. So the condition is this right here, if position is less than or equal to 0. And then we're going to be including a question mark, so it's basically like, if this is true, this should be the value of position. So this is the true value, this is the false value. So if it's true, so the true value should be first, then this should be the value of position. Otherwise, which is or else, which is basically encapsulated as a colon, then we include the false value, which is that position is going to be decremented by 1. So now we can remove this really lengthy if statement, and then we're going to apply sort of the same thing here for our next button. So once again, position is being the one is the variable in which the value depends on what the condition is, whether it's true or false. So once again, we're going to be including our condition, which is different. If position is greater than or equals to the number of slides subtracted by 1, and then after the question mark, we are going to be including the false value, which is 0. The true value, which is 0, and then the false value, which is that position will be incremented by 1. So once again, we can remove this lengthy if statement. Alright, so now we can put these two lines together in order to save more space. And now the last thing that we're going to be including is a function. We're going to be creating a function called update slider. And we want to call this function in our event listeners. So we're just going to, we haven't created the function yet, but we're just going to call these functions in these event listeners. So if the previous button is clicked, then the position should change and then the slider should be updated. So basically in this function, this is where we're going to be including, we're going to be removing and adding classes based on the old pause value, current value, and the pause current value. So now let's create this function called update slider. Now because old pos as well as pos are both global variables, we can access them in our function, and our constant is also global, so we can access them in our function as well. So we don't need to include them as parameters. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to remove the active class from the current slide that is being displayed, which should now be removed from display. So we're going to call in the slides array, and then we want to get the position of the old slide or the current slide that is being displayed without change just yet. And then we want to remove the active class from this slide so that it can no longer be displayed. So we're going to do this using this property called class list and then remove. So we want to remove the active class from the slide that is currently being displayed so that a new slide can be displayed. And then we're going to be calling the array once again so that we can access the new slide that should be displayed. So currently it has no active class, so we want to add the active class so that it can be displayed. And removing and adding this active class ensures that none of the slides are shown all together or all at once. A slide is always being removed and a slide is always being shown, so they will not be shown at the same time, or they will not be removed at the same time. There's always a slide being in display. Alright, so now when we reload our page, our function should work. So when we click on next, you can see that we get to see the new slide from position. Old pos would be slide 1, and the new pos, which is basically the new slide that should be displayed, is slide 2. And when we click on next, we still see the slides are being incremented by 1. However, now we're at slide 3, so this condition should be true. So when we click next again, it's been taken to slide 1, which is stored as position 0. And now we're at slide 1, and if we want to click on the previous button, this condition should be true, so therefore this value should be set. So this should be the current value. This should be the value that position should take. So when we click on previous button, we see that we're taken to the last slide, which is slide 3. And then when we click back again, this condition is false, and the value of position will be position minus 1. And then when we click again, same thing, slide 1. And then when we click again, we're taken back to slide 3. And the same thing goes when we click on next. So now we can consider our slider working and it functions just like we wanted to. So now we're going to be focusing on the design of our slider, as right now it looks really bleak. So we're going to head over to our homepage main background slider section, and instead of text, we're going to be displaying. Thank you so much for watching this video. Click on Code Harvest to watch more beginner-friendly, in-depth videos, and subscribe to our channel to stay tuned for part 2 of the background slider tutorial, where we focus on the design and display of the slider. See you in the next video. Goodbye!